Hey, welcome to our 14th episode of Rethinking Trauma and Transition. And we challenge, so Rethinking Trauma and Transition, we are challenging the stigma surrounding trauma and the healing through our podcast. And we aim to empower those who are experiencing these challenges, providing them with the knowledge and language necessary to embark on a transformative journey towards a more fulfilling life.
So what are we talking about this time, Rich?
We're having a discussion about anger, Ali, and what that means.
That's a lot more complex than it sounds.
Very much so, yeah. And I think everybody experiences anger differently. We all experience the world differently as well. But there's some common characteristics behind that.
Well, in a way, our experience of the world is our own individual hallucination of that, because we take all of our sensory input and we create an experience that we operate within that is entirely unique to us, because it depends on what we do with each of those bytes of information, how we interpret it. And while we can get a window into other people's world, we can't truly step into it, because they will always choose to create and use those different elements differently.
Yes. And obviously how we express ourselves are going to be different, but very common as well. So there's going to be some similarities, because I think the emotions and our sense of what could be right and wrong. So one person or group of people could have the same sense of what is a wrong to them and what angers them. So for argument's sake, it could be environmentalism, and they could get angry about destruction of, say, rainforest, trees cut down, that kind of thing. So there could be a whole community, a whole group expressing their anger towards that.
But even within that, their experience of that moment will be different and unique to them. I suppose when I was thinking about this podcast before we started, anger, for most people, you talk about anger, and it can seem quite straightforward in its meaning that it's communicating.
Mm-hmm.
Yet there are nuances and variances within that.
Very much so.
Like a spectrum. And some of the words that can be used for our emotional landscape are actually demonstrations of that spectrum.
Yeah.
So you look at all the different words we have to express that. You and I were playing with that just before we started in terms of those different labels that people attach to that.
Yeah. And I think at times is what we're also discussing as well. And what we're listening to is one of Paul Chek's podcasts. And what he was just chatting about in one segment of that was about how poorly we do communicate to one another, especially in the Western world. And that this leads to all sorts of problems because we're never able to really express ourselves, how we feel, what we mean, what our needs and wants are, as well as what our boundaries are as well. And this can lead to all.
You and I've touched on that in a few
Yeah,
of our episodes as well.
yeah. So that can lead to a sense of not being heard, a sense of frustration, a sense of shame, embarrassment, guilt, and all these other potentially negative emotions.
It can lead to resentment, because resentment is an expression of anger.
Yeah.
It can lead to hurt.
That hurt as well, Ali, can be internal as well.
Mm.
Because as we're not able to fully express what we mean and how to say this, what we're after, we can suppress ourselves and suppress these emotions. And that then leads to stress, disease, illnesses. And not so my very limited understanding is in Chinese medicine. I believe anger affects the liver. I could be very much wrong on that. So all these emotions are stored within the body, can potentially affect different organs and how we walk and how we move.
Well, that makes so much sense, because I suppose in a way those arrays of emotions, they're part of our fight flight response. You know, they come with corresponding changes in our physiology, which amp us up, which prepare us for future actions.
Yeah.
But these are temporary responses. They're only ever designed to be temporary.
Very much so.
To be like a defense mechanism.
Yeah. And if someone is holding on to all that negative emotion, as it were, not able to express themselves, it could potentially lead to long-term illnesses.
Mm-hmm.
As you were mentioning before, was that burning ember, weren't you, Ali?
Yeah, because I was saying to Rich that I was brought up in a coal mining community, and there were coal bins, which is just big, huge piles, almost like mini mountains of all the coal dust and the slag from the pits that serves no purpose. You can't use it for anything. But it wasn't unheard of for them to go on fire. And the problem was, once a bin was burning, it never really stopped. It might look like it was no longer on fire. There'd be no smoke, there'd be no flame, there'd be a fairly stable crust on the surface of that. But underneath, deep in the center of that coal bin, the embers would still be burning. And for some of the less volatile expressions of anger, because if you think about it, you've got things like, you've got that traditional view of that anger outburst, of that rage or fury, and they're very immediate and very out there and externalized. But you've got some of the more internalized ones, like resentment or indignation, and they're like those embers that are deep down in the middle of that coal bin. And while they're not always visible and they might not even be acknowledged, what they're actually doing is, over a period of time, is they're continuing to burn away the integrity and the stability of that bin, until at some point they create enough of a gap within the internal core that the surface collapses, the oxygen comes in and the flames burst. And that's almost like, I mean, you and I talk a lot also about things like moral injury, Rich.
Mm-hmm.
And it always strikes me that part and parcel of that sometimes is, especially where you've got moral injury, where you've got maybe betrayal or sanctuary trauma, is that kind of expression of anger sometimes can be that resentment that this has happened. That when that's there and it's carried and not released, when it's still there, it's those embers waiting for the next point that's going to give that burst of oxygen, and that next slight that's going to be reminiscent of the original injury or similar to the betrayal trauma or the sanctuary trauma, that's going to cause that surface to cave and the flames to burst out.
And that can then be a very unhealthy expression of anger.
Not only is it an unhealthy expression of it, it's the damage it does when we carry that for such a long period of time. Because we might think we've got a handle on it and we're ignoring it, but underneath, those embers are still continuing to do damage to the integrity of ourselves, our internal stability. Is it threat?
Yeah. And I think that's a hangover from not lots of people like confrontation. And I think confrontation can be quite a nasty thing, but it's also useful to express what you mean and get it off your chest. Because if something's bothering you, people have to know about it, because that's, as we've mentioned so many times before, that's an encroachment on your own personal boundaries. And if you're not happy with something, then let people know in a healthy way without any judgment. So instead of accusing someone, saying what you're doing is upsetting me, is really getting my goat, then it might be a better way of saying, this isn't really right for me. Can you do this in a different way? Being more, I suppose, diplomatic, but expressing what you really mean and how you really feel about the situation.
Well, I think that comes back to the point you were making earlier about communication. How the fact is that most of us in the Western world are really, really bad at it. You know, we're really bad, especially us Brits. Us Brits are really, really bad at owning our emotions, at actually expressing our emotions. It's that whole kind of, you know, we don't, that's just too much. It's almost like it's unclean to have an emotion. And yet, if we don't express those, then all that happens is we end up feeling, as you said, misunderstood and judged unfairly, and then you've got the embers burning underneath that you're carrying that's destabilizing your structures, because you haven't got the words, or you're frustrated with somebody else's lack of understanding, when actually maybe that's just that we need to learn to be a bit more adaptable and to try it more than one way until we get the understanding. Yeah.
I can't remember the whole of the sketch, but you reminded me of, you ever come across a guy called Rich Hall?
No.
He's an American comedian who lives over here. And he was saying about how when a Brit gets really angry, they start writing letters. You know, I think he said they walk around in the circles for a little bit and get really upset. And then that same thing still keeps going on. And then when he get really, really upset, you start writing letters to people. So then he can.
And they're probably very polite letters too.
A lot of passive aggressiveness in it.
Yeah. And I think timing's really important in those conversations. And I think you were touching on that there, Rich, in that sometimes the longer we leave those embers, the more difficult it becomes to actually address that breach of our boundary, or the breach of our values. That sense of injustice that you feel has been done to you because somebody has misunderstood or misinterpreted, or jumped to a conclusion and not heard you. And the longer we leave it, the more damage that ember does, and the more chance that it will breach the surface. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we should immediately kind of keep trying to pound somebody into the understanding of our experience, because that doesn't always work very well either.
No.
Especially when it's the heat of the moment. But there is definitely value to be had with going, can we have a chat about that?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And at times as well, as you said, it may not be the right time to have that chat because it's just too heated and people aren't thinking properly. So maybe worthwhile saying, I still want to have this heart connection with you. But in this circumstance, I do need to walk away and we need to sit down at another time and another place to have this conversation. Because right now, we're not able to communicate effectively. At a slightly later date, we will be able to, because our emotions won't be so as high. We'll be able to think with better clarity as to what the real problem was. And because in a lot of these emotions and a lot of this heated debate, you come across the Betari box.
No.
There's another word for it as well. So my attitude affects my behavior, which affects your attitude, which affects your behavior. So the less we commute, the less effective our communication is. That spirals down and down and down very rapidly. So the easiest way to change that is physiology. And taking a break from that situation will give us better physiology to be able to walk away, come back at a later date, and then express what that problem is and a better solution to that problem. Because we just kind of go round and round in a circle of, you've accused me of this, I've accused you of that kind of scenario.
Well, I think that's about, we run the risk of falling into familiar patterns, don't we, in recreating scripts?
Yeah.
Because I wholeheartedly agree with you that sometimes the art form of that communication, it's expressing where we are at, but also in a way that sometimes buys us a bit of processing time ourselves, so that we're not in that full-on, I'm jumping into the tried and tested conversation mode, but allowing ourselves that processing time to step away from the edge and reflect a bit over what it is we actually want to achieve in that conversation, and which parts of it are really important to us and which on reflection actually don't really mean very much. Because sometimes that can be a familiar pattern we've fallen into where we haven't actually reflected on for a long time over whether or not it serves us any purpose, gets us any further forward, or if indeed there's a better way for us to express what we're experiencing. Because in that moment, if we're in fight and flight, our thoughts are all over the place. What we're not doing at that point is considering anything other than our own emotional response. We give ourselves time to reflect, time to process. And it's a chance for us to have a different structure to that conversation, to approach it from a different angle, to express to the other person that actually I'm here to hear you. That is also important to me, but can I please have the space to explain to you why this is important to me, why this is upsetting me?
Yeah. So we've covered a fair bit of the negatives of anger, haven't we?
We have.
There are obviously some positives to go along with that as well.
Is this where we discuss my angry cleaning habit?
No, I wasn't going to discuss it at all. You brought it up, so you can if you wish. So what I was going to mention is that anger could be useful of getting us out of a rut, for argument's sake, or we're at threshold with something. So it could be giving up smoking, and you've tried so many times before, and it's always failed. And you go, right, this time I'm really pissed off with myself. I've got to stop. I've got to stop this habit now. It's just not worth doing anymore.
It's that final nudge to get us over the finishing line.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. So it can be, so anger can be useful in identifying these problems that we have of, say, use the example of smoking. So it's identified that problem and getting really upset with yourself, pissed off with yourself that something has to change in a positive way.
I'm searching for words because there was something that kind of landed in my head as you were talking there, Rich, and it's almost like sometimes anger is the catalyst.
Mm.
And that's linked to that threshold point you were talking about, that point where we recognize that enough.
Yeah.
That point of, I suppose, where we have maybe given ground, we have retreated, or we've stepped away, or we haven't expressed ourselves, where we recognize that actually now I am unprepared to go any further. This now has to change and has to have a different outcome.
Yeah. So it's kind of then like a form of protection from things that can hurt us as well. So if we're using anger to set our boundaries, that's stopping people from proceeding and trespassing on our own personal territory when we've had enough of that aspect of it.
I'm going to cycle back, because right at the start you were talking about communities and community anger.
Mm.
And I think there's a feel for that we're talking about, which is almost kind of that sense of righteous indignation. And that's another expression of anger in that spectrum, where we go, enough.
Mm.
And that's where you see significant changes happen, because people come together with that shared expression of anger.
That's in a way is people challenging injustices, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I'm going to kind of come back to that idea of anger as a defense, a final line of defense for our boundaries as well, because I think there's still scope in there for reflection on how we communicate that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very much so, yeah.
And that's about us learning to be a lot more intentional in our words.
So would that be then being assertive?
Yes, and it's also about owning what is ours and not blaming others.
Yeah.
You know, there's a very fine difference between I am feeling angry because my boundaries are being breached and my values I feel are not being recognized, to I am feeling anger because you're driving me up the wall and I don't like what you've said or done. One is about blame, the other is about a clear expression of your own emotional state and your own values.
Mm-hmm.
And of the two, the expression of your own experience with no blame is more likely to get a positive response and better understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. As I mentioned previously, is pointing fingers at people in judgment.
Yeah.
It's not useful. As the old saying goes, is you point a finger at someone, you got three pointing back at you.
Well, the thing is as well, what you immediately do is put people in a defensive situation,
Yeah.
in a defensive posture.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge we have is with most people that we have a relationship with, there will probably be very few of us who have relationships with people who truly listen, who are very skilled at that.
Yeah. I've worked with quite a few people who've only heard what they want to hear. After you've explained something to someone, the whole process or why something isn't as good as it could be, they've gone and said the not a complete opposite, but only heard what they wanted to hear and just completely made up what I've said.
Mhm.
I'm sure there's plenty of people who can relate to similar things as to that.
I think
And
there's
that
probably
again is ineffective communication by that person who's doing the listening.
there's a reason for that. And it's about how that dynamic of listening and response actually works. So that means that for most of us, when we listen, what we're actually doing is we're listening for the first couple of seconds, and then we're already in construction mode. We're already building our response. Now, because we're in builder mode at the same time, that means that our ears are not effectively tuning in. We don't hear all of the message and all of the content. We're now just cherry picking keywords that's going to fit with our response that actually we're constructing in the background, waiting for the gap or the breath point so that we can butt in and put our point across.
That's right. Yeah.
That means that, I mean, listen, you and I listen for a living. You know, we
Well,
could
we
be
do our best to.
professional listeners.
Sometimes we do zone out.
But there are times that I know that I am, you know, particularly for instance with family members or whatever, where I know that I've kind of got to kind of step into that zone a bit more consciously because the patterns are too familiar.
Yeah.
For me, and I've got to be a lot more conscious in that skill. Whereas when I'm working one-on-one with someone as a client, that skill's fully on board there because that's what I'm there to do. And the experience is very different for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, often the people that we're working with haven't had a voice, or they don't believe they've had a voice. And hearing them goes a long way to helping them be better about themselves.
Well, for quite a lot of people. And don't get me wrong, I have people that I mean, I know you tease me about it as well, the fact that you can spot when I'm thinking because my eyes are all over the place and that sort of stuff. And also because I do that whole kind of sideways gaze when I'm thinking, that's my processing space I'm going to. Now that means that my clients very quickly learn that when that happens when they stop speaking, when they have stopped and they have expressed that, then that's when I'm in my thinking space, because what I'm now doing is reflecting on the whole content of what they've told me. But what often happens as a result of that is they have that moment where they have that recognition that actually I've never been heard like that before.
Yeah.
And I've given that and talked clients through that in terms of try this with your partner. To step away from the desire to construct your response and just listen. And when they do that, they've come back to me and gone, well, that was different. That was really different. Because they've picked up on different things. They've had different outcomes. And they've broken patterns. And things change. There's power in that space, in giving
So,
people the space to be heard. For both sides.
yeah. I believe the word is, there's a Japanese word, I think it's Otonashi, which means pure silence.
Mm.
And in that silence, there's every single sound, every single noise, every single frequency, where everything is heard and everything is listened to.
The way I describe it sometimes is that in that moment of listening, I am still.
Mm-hmm.
Because that gives the space to other people,
Yeah.
allows them to inhabit and step into that space.
A friend of mine, Mark, his wife was, I believe it was a course to do with social work. I couldn't tell you, I can't remember, it's a while ago now. So she was doing her degree. And he asked her, what you've been doing today? And she replied, listening. So he started taking the mick a bit out of her. Then he'd follow on throughout her degree, what have you been doing today? And the response was always listening. And then until he truly started hearing what she had to say, he said that it's one of the hardest things in the world to do, is truly listen to people. Because you mentioned already, Ali, it's all about, I've got my interjects, what I want, my input, how I feel about the situation, and all those repeating stories, those repeating patterns are going to go ahead and never be broken into something new, something more profound, something that's more worthwhile for people.
When we don't give that space, we're also stepping into place rife with assumptions, because in the creation of our response, we're making assumptions about what the other person is going to say or the other person means.
And you know what to say about assumptions, don't you? Or assuming things like that.
No, I've never heard that one. Tell me.
No, I'm sure not. So we'll have to repeat it then.
Yeah. What does it mean?
Well, they say when you assume something, make an ass out of you and me.
Mm-hmm. And it may be a very old one, but it's a very true one.
Yeah.
When we don't give that space, then what we do is we are feeding our embers and ignoring the fact that there might be actually an opportunity to put some of those out that we're missing because we are not paying attention.
Yeah.
And I think that comes back to that flash response in terms of anger as well. Now, you and I were talking about the fact that we're going to do a follow-on episode that's talking more about how you manage that flash response, because a lot of people struggle with that, in that initial step of finding a way to create some of that space so they get a different outcome, because the flash response becomes so embedded, because maybe the embers have been burning for a very long time and are much closer to the surface than maybe they want to acknowledge for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, yeah.
Old hurts, old injustices, old resentments.
All those old wounds.
All those old wounds. Because that's what those are. These are wounds. These are hurts.
And it's maybe it's like unpicking that scab or that scar.
Well, I'm going to go back to the Kolbing again. Because in order to put the Kolbing out in a way, you actually have to create the route through to the embers so that you can do that safely.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, then you never know where in the surface of that Kolbing the embers are going to break through. You have no way to anticipate that. You know, we used to get so much grief because, of course, these things were like kids' playgrounds, but so dangerous. And the adults knew that, but did the kids believe them for a minute? No, they just wanted to play in the bings. But the adults, they'd probably be shocked and white with horror because they knew there were embers under there waiting to breach the surface, because those bings never went out. And that in a way, sometimes when we talk about anger and the damage it does and anger management, I actually think it's an awful lot more nuanced and an awful lot more complex than sometimes people initially acknowledge. Because quite often what we're talking about is the embers deep within that pile, deep down.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about controlling the flash and burn.
No. There's one positive aspect that we haven't really discussed yet is, and he kind of touched on it, was helping us feel more energized and focused on tasks.
Are we back to my angry cleaning again?
I was going to mention that, but you can if you wish.
I was laughing when we were talking about this because I know that if something really irritates me and kind of hits all my buttons, I have a habit of angry cleaning, and it's amazing how much I can get done in a very short period of time when I'm angry cleaning and tidying. But yeah. And that's exactly that, isn't it? That's that energizer. It's the call to action.
Yeah. Being adrenalized to get a task done, what you need to get done. So anger does have obviously its positive aspects as well as a negative. It's just how we choose to experience that.
I think that's an interesting choice of words, how we choose to experience it. Because it strikes me there is a choice to be made in that.
There's always a choice. And it's often how we perceive these choices afterwards, whether they're positive or negative ones.
Hmm. But I think that's also about maybe recognizing our journey towards the flashpoint. So many recurring themes, isn't there?
There is.
Because there is probably going to be steps along the way. There will always be the point where the surface of that coal bin gives way, and all of a sudden, without any warning, there's that flash burn. That happens.
It does. But some places, some situations, is probably not very useful. Say, classic examples of road rage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Then that can be quite deadly. Or, and there's people who've murdered neighbours because of a dispute over boundary lines and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be a useful place to express that anger.
Yeah. And that's about recognizing when we can channel it into an enabling energy. Because what's also really powerful about that is that it helps it dissipate. Because coming back to some of your original points, Rich, when we hold on to those, just like the embers in that thing, it burns away, it causes damage. It causes damage to our physiology. It has a negative impact on us, the biological being. It can cause long-term damage and expressions of stress, heightened blood pressure, whole host of associated conditions that are all about unexpressed emotions.
When it's a bit like acid dripping on a beautiful untarnished metal surface, and eventually that metal surface becomes tarnished and gets eaten away until there's a hole through it, and that burn, that splash of the acid just spreads more and more throughout and across that metal surface.
And it will continue to eat away until it's neutralized.
Or it's found something else to burn through.
Yeah. But it's true what they say about these emotions when unexpressed being, and I'll use your analogy, I'll dress it up slightly different, being corrosive. They are. If not necessarily on the surface, then underneath they will be. And that's about us acknowledging their existence, acknowledging the risk, and then choosing to do something about that. Choosing to do something different about that, whether that's change our communication style, listen differently so that we find out more information that we didn't have, because that's the whole point of that listening thing. It's not just about giving somebody agency and making them feel heard.
Pardon?
Witty man.
No, no.
It's about us fundamentally having the full range to find out exactly what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's information gathering.
Yeah.
Without the pressure of immediate response. It takes the pressure off us and allows us in that moment to be more present and more curious and explore our understanding of the situation, which in turn means the other person feels heard in a way they hadn't before. We're more likely to ask questions. We're more likely to clarify points, to ask for further explanation, to say, I don't understand that yet. Can you try and give me that in a different way? Tell me more about it when we're listening in that way. Information gathering.
Mm. Yeah. And that doesn't really matter then if the other person isn't listening to you. At least you know that you are putting in that effort to be enabling them to be heard. And then maybe eventually they can respond in time. And they may not have that skill yet, just yet, to be able to communicate as effectively as what you're doing now.
Well, a strange thing happens when we listen like that. It rubs off.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes without us intending it to, because by creating the space, by being curious and asking for more information, not less, by being open to exploring that other person's viewpoint, we break their pattern. They start to respond differently because they have to, because they're no longer in familiar territory. They haven't had the response they were anticipating, and that pushes them into a moment of reflection where they have to now construct something differently because the response they were anticipating giving no longer fits. And they start to listen differently.
You'd hope so.
I can't give you 100% guarantee rate, but
No.
it has a pretty high success rate.
Yeah, yeah. There are some pig-headed people out there. Maybe at some point they will come round.
Maybe, and then maybe that's about us making a choice and a decision in terms of what we feel is acceptable to us at that point, whether that's a relationship we want to maintain and keep.
Absolutely.
But the point is that we make a decision from a point of reflection, not from a point of
Resentment.
flash fire.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In summary then, Ali, we've been talking about the slow burn of anger and a flash fire of anger as well, and how that can affect people. So could potentially affect people with stress and immune issues. So they affect organs and posture and physiology of someone.
Very much.
Yeah.
And I think it's also about recognizing that anger is a really complex emotion. that it has a spectrum of experiences. You know, we experience expressions of that quite often as part and parcel of other things. You know, we experience it as part of grief. We experience it as part of, as an outrage or a resentment, all of which we might not necessarily always target and label as anger, but actually it's a component part of it. It can be a component part of moral injury, of long simmering issues, of relationships, repeating patterns, and complex and simple trauma.
And also as well then is there are positive aspects to anger. So they can help you get tasks done. It can help you to yourself over that threshold point, as it were.
And we can at times harness it very effectively to
Clean the house.
Clean the house, but also to give us the impetus to finally take that step out of our comfort zone and do something different, to fire us up enough that we go, enough, something has to change now. But that also means that in that moment, then it seems to me that there's probably been some acknowledgement of that in the run up to it. There has been an array of the experiences of that anger. And quite often, probably a partner of that array is frustration, because that's an expression of anger too. It's just that more often than not, frustration is expressed towards ourselves.
Yeah. So if you've enjoyed this episode of Rethinking Trauma and Transition,
let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you could leave us a review and a 5-star rating and all that sort of good stuff, we most appreciate that.
Yep. And we've said we'll come back with some tools and techniques and some more structure in terms of how to make some changes in terms of your anger strategies and your anger management and your anger responses. So if there's anything in particular that you would like us to address or have a conversation about, then do let us know. We're always interested in feedback, and we'll do our best to give you that response and that feedback.
Definitely. Thank you for listening to Rethinking Trauma and Transition.
Until next time.
Next time.